On January 23, 1942, in Liverpool, England, 19-year-old Janet O'Keefe stood inside a government-requisitioned building, staring at a large number 4 painted over a grid. Each square in that grid symbolized a single nautical mile of the Atlantic. She held a small piece of white chalk, while seasoned naval officers with decades of sea experience looked on doubtfully. None of them were prepared for the reality that a young woman with zero naval background was about to outperform them in submarine warfare. Captain Gilbert Roberts straightened his collar, aware of what was about to take place. At 41, he had been forced ashore 4 years earlier due to tuberculosis, and many within the Admiralty believed he had been handed a hopeless and almost comedic assignment. He had been placed in charge of the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, a wargaming organization that critics mocked as nothing more than children drawing on the floor while Britain's merchant shipping was being destroyed. Yet Roberts recognized something the Admiralty refused to accept. In March 1941, Germany had sunk 41 merchant vessels. By June, the number had risen to 61. In November, one convoy alone lost 13 ships. The statistics painted a grim picture. Everything the Royal Navy believed about anti-submarine warfare was fundamentally flawed. What Janet O'Keefe and the other young women gathering in that room did not yet realize was that within just 16 months, their work would transform the Battle of the Atlantic. Admirals would travel to Liverpool specifically to lose simulated battles to them. And by May 1943, their chalk marks on a linoleum floor would contribute to Admiral Karl Donitz ordering his entire U-boat fleet to retreat. Churchill would later remark that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly terrified him during the war. But he would not mention the teenage women with stopwatches who kept Britain from starvation. To understand why the Royal Navy needed saving from its own doctrines, one must look at the North Atlantic in early 1942. German submarines were not behaving as British strategists anticipated. They were not conducting daylight periscope attacks from underwater. They were pulling off something the textbooks insisted could not work. Under the cover of darkness, U-boats surfaced behind convoys and slipped into their formation unseen, behaving like wolves stalking a herd. They launched torpedoes at extremely close range before diving into the ensuing panic. Escorts rarely understood what had happened until 2 or 3 ships were already ablaze. These coordinated wolfpack assaults were devastating. Groups of 8 to 20 submarines were directed by radio from Donitz's headquarters in France. A single U-boat would locate a convoy and transmit its position. The rest would rendezvous ahead of its path. At nightfall, they attacked from several angles at once. But British convoy strategy was based on outdated assumptions from World War I, isolated submarines making surface periscope attacks in daylight. Escorts were trained to combat that old threat, not this new coordinated brutality. In January 1942, there was no unified method to respond to wolfpacks. Commanders were expected to rely on personal judgment, decide, give orders, wait for responses, and act only once everything was clarified. Lieutenant Commander Peter Gretton, who lived through multiple wolfpack battles, later delivered a devastating truth. British doctrine assumed commanders would have time to think, yet the Germans allowed them only seconds. Lives were lost while officers waited for permission to defend themselves. Roberts understood the disastrous reality because he had spent 4 years watching the Navy deny it. From shore, he saw the Admiralty focus on building more ships, improving sonar, and increasing manpower, while never questioning the core beliefs guiding anti-submarine strategy. So he proposed a revolutionary idea: rigorous tactical learning through wargames. No more theoretical conversations in comfortable rooms. Real-time simulations with incomplete information, forcing officers to make rapid decisions under pressure, followed immediately by mathematical evaluation of outcomes. The Admiralty granted him a facility, a budget, and authorization to experiment. What they did not provide were experienced officers. Every trained strategist was already at sea. He needed people who could calculate interception plots quickly, monitor sonar ranges, and track multiple fast-changing situations under intense urgency. He found exactly that in the Women's Royal Naval Service, the WRNS. Janet O'Keefe joined the Western Approach's tactical unit at age 19. Her upbringing in a well-to-do Liverpool family had not prepared her for a wartime role commanding simulated submarines in tactical battles against high-ranking naval veterans. Joan Laidlaw arrived from Scotland with expertise in accountancy, precise thinking hidden behind humor. She dubbed their first major tactical breakthrough Raspberry, a playful gesture directed at Hitler despite the grim stakes. Laura Janet Hose, affectionately called Bobby, was a mathematical genius. Her calculations determined whether escort ships in the simulations spotted lurking U-boats or perished in ambush. Mary Wales was chosen specifically for her insight into coordinated teamwork from sports, particularly hockey. June Duncan, who would eventually become a famous fashion model, was, at that moment, busy computing interception courses and depth charge deployment patterns. Roberts designed a system that was intentionally unforgiving, a simple floor grid representing the Atlantic, where every chalk mark meant life or death in the real world. Behind large canvas screens, equipped with tiny peepholes, players could view only a limited slice of the battlefield, just like real convoy commanders peering through binoculars into the darkness, unaware of the full tactical picture. The WRNS personnel, armed with colored chalk, essentially controlled the fate of the simulated battles. Green lines marked the unseen movements of U-boats, while white chalk tracked escort ships. Every mark was made or erased as 2-minute turns rapidly counted down. There was no pausing, no rewinding. A wrong decision meant watching a chalk-drawn merchant ship vanish from the grid, symbolizing the irreplaceable cargo of ammunition, food, and fuel keeping Britain alive. Officers who were accustomed to slow, deliberate decision-making suddenly had just 120 seconds to issue commands, while young women calculated sonar results and plotted outcomes. These outcomes weren't guessed. Everything was based on physics and mathematics. Sonar range changed with sea conditions and water temperature, torpedoes were plotted using target bearings and speed, and illumination patterns depended on weather and wind alignment. For 2 decades, the Royal Navy had ignored this type of tactical analysis. Now, the survival of the nation depended on acquiring it in a hurry. The earliest wargames exposed a devastating truth. Every anti-submarine tactic being taught made the situation worse. The official response to a torpedo strike required the senior escort commander to evaluate the situation, determine the direction of the threat, issue precise instructions to each ship, and coordinate execution. This took between 8 and 12 minutes, time during which U-boats, firing from multiple directions, could sink more ships and then disappear into the deep before any counterattack began. Shockingly, this flaw was discovered by the WRNS personnel themselves. They had no submarine background. They simply studied German tactics from manuals and asked, "What would we do if we were the hunters?" Then they tested their theories on the board and consistently shredded British doctrine. Throughout February and March 1942, WRNS-run U-boats destroyed simulated convoys even faster than actual U-boats were destroying real ones. The Royal Navy's defensive philosophy was fundamentally broken. The breakthrough came from Joan Laidlaw. She named the new tactic Raspberry, a cheeky taunt directed at Hitler. The idea seemed absurdly simple. As soon as a torpedo hit, the attacked ship fired 2 white signal rockets and transmitted the word Raspberry over the radio. Instantly, every escort ship rushed to the convoy's outer edge and launched star shells to flood the area with light. Crucially, any ship could act. No more waiting for permission from the senior officer. The innovation wasn't a new weapon or new technology. It was the removal of hesitation. Rapid initiative replaced rigid hierarchy. In simulation, response time fell from 8 minutes to just 90 seconds. U-boats attacking on the surface suddenly found themselves exposed in brilliant light, forced to crash dive early while escorts were already closing in with sonar contact and depth charges ready. Roberts scheduled Raspberry to become official doctrine in May 1943, but it never entered the manual. It was so effective that Admiral Donitz altered U-boat tactics before the paperwork was even finalized. Victory had outpaced bureaucracy. Still, one last trial was required before the Navy committed fully. In November 1942, Admiral Max Horton, newly appointed Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches, legendary for his aggressive submarine command in World War I, traveled to Liverpool to evaluate Outwitted. He could have ended the entire program in a single decision. Instead, he stepped into the war game. Janet O'Keefe and Joan Laidlaw played the U-boat commanders. Horton personally took charge of the convoy escorts. What followed became part of Outwitted legend. Throughout the morning, the teenage women defeated him 5 separate times. They spotted his patterns, predicted his reactions, and exploited every assumption he made. A battle-hardened admiral, credited with sinking enemy ships during wartime, was repeatedly undone by young women who had never set foot on a submarine, but who approached warfare as mathematics, probability, and logic, rather than instinct. After the 5th loss, Horton stood up, looked directly at Captain Roberts, and declared, "This works." "How many officers have you trained?" "About 200 so far, sir," Roberts replied. "Not nearly enough. I want every escort commander in Western Approaches trained here. 50 officers per week, continuously, until the entire fleet has completed this course." From that point forward, Horton became their most influential supporter. After the war, he openly credited Roberts and his team for playing a significant role in Germany's defeat. His predecessor, Admiral Sir Percy Noble, went even further, stating plainly that without victory in the Atlantic, Britain would have lost the war, and Outwitted had ensured that victory. Between February 1942 and July 1945, the Western Approaches Tactical Unit trained 5,000 officers from Britain, Canada, the United States, New Zealand, Norway, South Africa, Poland, and Free France. Groups of 50 arrived each week for intensive instruction, compressing months of costly battlefield learning into days of safe simulation. It was designed to shatter egos. Commanders who had survived real torpedoes and explosions found themselves repeatedly defeated by young women less than half their age. The message could not be clearer. German U-boat captains were adaptable and cunning. A tactic that worked last month might be fatal now. Only fast thinking, rapid coordination, and aggressive initiative could win. By mid-1942, the officers returning to sea shared a new tactical language. When the alarm sounded and a convoy came under attack, escorts no longer waited for orders or wasted time on talk. They acted instantly and cohesively. They had trained against simulated enemies who thought exactly like real U-boat aces, because those aces' tactics had been studied and mastered by WRNS analysts. The results began to show in the shipping numbers, but at first the situation got even worse. March 1943 became the deadliest month of the war for Allied merchant ships. Between 95 and 120 merchant ships were lost in the Atlantic and Arctic during that period, most of them while traveling in convoys that were supposed to offer maximum protection. The Royal Navy began questioning whether the entire convoy system was still viable as a defensive strategy. The Admiralty later admitted that Germany had come closer than ever to severing the lifeline between the Old World and the New. Britain had only 3 months' worth of food remaining. If the losses continued at the same pace, the nation would run out of supplies before summer. Churchill's government even began drafting plans for a negotiated end to the war. Then everything changed in May 1943. That month alone, the Germans lost 41 U-boats while sinking only 13 merchant vessels, a nearly 1-to-1 ratio that Germany could not sustain. On May 23rd and 24th, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz ordered all U-boats to withdraw from North Atlantic convoy routes, effectively acknowledging defeat in the decisive theater of the Battle of the Atlantic. Several technological advancements contributed to this turning point. Long-range Liberator bombers finally closed the mid-Atlantic air gap. Escort carriers extended air coverage beyond the reach of land-based aircraft. Centimetric radar allowed escorts to detect surfaced submarines far beyond human sight. Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars eliminated the underwater gap where depth charges were ineffective. Yet the key factor enabling escorts to use these tools effectively came from that chalk-covered linoleum floor in Liverpool. Women the Admiralty initially saw as mere clerks had devised revolutionary new tactics. How to coordinate sweeps, when to illuminate the sea, which ships should chase attackers, and which must remain to shield the convoy. Raspberry was only the beginning. Watteau produced a full tactical arsenal. Pineapple countered wolfpack formations using wide zigzag maneuvers and selective use of star shells, bright enough to expose U-boats but not reveal the convoy. Banana replaced Raspberry for single submarine attacks, combining radar and sonar for a faster synchronized response. Beta Search predicted where a shadowing U-boat would move based on convoy behavior, a counterintuitive approach that proved remarkably successful. Step Aside, improvised within only 3 days after the first acoustic torpedo attack in September 1943, instructed escorts to run at full power directly toward the submarine for 2 minutes, then turn 60 degrees for 3 more minutes, breaking the torpedo's acoustic lock. Every tactic was tested repeatedly in the linoleum laboratory before being shared with the fleet. Crews returned from battle with real-world feedback, enabling rapid refinement and redeployment of improved methods. U-boat commanders reported to Donitz that escort ships were responding with unnatural speed and coordination. Watteau had trained officers to act instantly based on shared knowledge rather than wait for instructions, eliminating the confusion and communication delays U-boats once exploited. German hydrophone operators who once tracked convoys from 40 kilometers away suddenly could not detect them until escorts were dangerously close. The shift was so stark that the Germans initially assumed that new classified technologies must be responsible. Meanwhile, some merchant ships received acoustic reduction improvements thanks to an unlikely innovator, a 28-year-old American merchant marine cook named Thomas "Tommy" Lawson, who noticed unusual underwater sounds coming from Liberty ships. His story is one of many unexpected contributions. Again and again throughout 1942 and 1943, crucial breakthroughs came from sources nobody expected. First rejected by authorities, then validated under real combat conditions, quickly implemented to save thousands of lives, followed by decades of historical silence about the people behind them. Watteau's wartime role remained classified long after victory. The women who invented Raspberry, Pineapple, and Beta Search returned to ordinary lives without acclaim. Janet O'Keefe, a simulated destroyer commander at only 19, faded into obscurity. Joan Laidlaw's name appears in barely any history books. June Duncan became a celebrated fashion model, but her wartime brilliance remained unknown. Captain Gilbert Roberts received some recognition, but far less than he deserved. Post-war narratives favored machines, not minds. Radar, sonar, hedgehog mortars, those technologies made for compelling stories. Chalk and stopwatches did not. Only with Simon Parkin's book, A Game of Birds and Wolves, did the truth begin to reach the public. The records survived. The voices did not. Unlike their male counterparts, few WRNS veterans wrote memoirs or granted interviews. The culture that welcomed their intelligence during wartime silenced it when peace returned. The story reveals a universal pattern in institutional innovation. Step 1. Rejection. New ideas are dismissed because they challenge tradition and authority. Admirals mocked the idea of teenage girls teaching them tactics. Step 2. Advocacy. A single influential individual steps in to defend the idea and demand testing. Horton did this for WATU. Step 3. Validation. Results in the field make the innovation undeniable. WATU trained officers turned the tide of the Atlantic War. Step 4. Rapid adoption. Success leads to mass adoption. WATU trained 5,000 officers in just over 3 years. Step 5. Erasure. Once victory is achieved, the institution forgets or minimizes the origin of the innovation. This cycle indicates that institutional bias isn't accidental. It is built into the system. Hierarchical forces maintain discipline and uniformity, but they also resist the adaptive thinking needed for breakthroughs. Admirals who had devoted their lives to mastering naval warfare could not initially accept that young women with chalk could identify fatal flaws in their thinking. In 1942, Britain faced annihilation. Ships sunk daily and hunger threatened the population. The crucial ideas came from those the establishment initially disregarded. Officers forced into retirement, young women trained in mathematics and logic, ordinary people who dared to question what the experts insisted was true. Janet O'Keefe led imaginary destroyers at 19 and was forgotten. The women of WATU helped save Britain and returned to anonymity. The institutions they rescued survived largely unchanged, learning little from their own near destruction. WATU's tactical analysis methods have influenced naval warfare throughout the Cold War and beyond. But the bigger lesson remains ignored by most organizations. Expertise can blind as easily as it can guide. These young women proved that intelligence, creativity, and bold thinking can emerge from anywhere. 80 years later, most institutions still believe that breakthroughs come only from established experts. And even when proven wrong, many still refuse to see what is right in front of them.